Hi there, this is Nathan Weeks from Faber Industrial Technologies. In this video, we will be covering how to build a PC for industrial applications, in particular, machine vision applications. However, the process and concepts would remain the same for basically any application. You would just tailor the componentry to suit your needs. Here's a basic rundown of the components you will need. A hard drive for storage, 2 pairs which will be rated together in our case, SATA cables for each drive, a power supply, an optical drive, RAM, a graphics card, processor, an operating system, a motherboard, and a case. Here's a list of all the components in this build for your reference. Let's get started with the build. The first thing we're going to do is remove all the inner pieces of this case so that we can mount all of the components. That will include removing the brace which secures PCI cards, the bay for the optical drives, and the hard drive bay. This bag includes all the various screws that we will need to fasten things down. Let's dress the cables from the front and the back in such a way that we have unrestricted access to the base of the case. The first thing that we're going to put in this case will be the motherboard. In order to do that, we will need to install standoffs to allow the motherboard to be installed without breaking any of the components on the back side of it, as well as to properly ground it. Where you install these will vary based on which motherboard and which case you have. Here's our motherboard. There are some additional non-screwed standoffs that we'll place in the indicated holes. Once that's done, we'll install our processor. Remove the shipping cover and the security latch. When you open your processor, you should note a white mark in one of the corners. This will match up with one of the corners in the receptacle on the motherboard. Carefully drop the processor into the outline and make sure it is seated properly. Do not push it in. Modern processors merely need to make contact with the pins. Latch the processor door down on top of it carefully. Next, we'll install the processor fan. If it did not come with the thermal paste applied, you will want to apply some. Place it over top of the processor and press firmly down on the pins to attach it to the motherboard. Take care not to crack the motherboard when installing this. Next, we'll install the RAM. Refer to the manual for your motherboard for how to install the RAM that you plan on using. Since we have 2 sticks of RAM, we'll be installing it in the 2 black holders you see there. Open up the carriers so that we can press the RAM in. You will know the RAM is fully seated when the carriers click shut on the RAM. Let's install the SATA cables while we've got the motherboard out of the case. There's a little bit more space to do so right now. These red cables will be going to the hard drives and connect to the motherboard in the indicated ports. We'll also be using an optical drive, so we'll be inserting a SATA cable for that as well. That wraps up the motherboard for now. Let's mount the hard drives into that removable rack. Due to the nature of our application, we will be using 2 pairs of hard drives mirrored together with RAID, with the 2 1TB drives being the main storage and the 2 500 gig hard drives being the operating system. A pair of solid-state drives would be faster for the operating system, but this application does not call for it, and we need the reliability over top of the speed. Next up is the optical drive. We need to remove one of these faces. Once we have that out, just slide the optical drive and secure it back in there. Lastly, let's remove the braces from that case brace. Normally those would be used for securing large cards to the motherboard. However, since we don't have any of those, we'll just take those out. It will gain us a large amount of space inside the case anyway, which we'll need later. Let's bring the case back in. Before installing the motherboard, we need to put in the cover plate for the plugs on the back. This just snaps into place. Make sure to bend back any tabs that would inhibit the ports going onto the motherboard. Then, carefully place the motherboard onto the standoffs on the base of the case. Line up the standoffs with the holes and insert the screws to hold it down. Don't over-tighten these. Make sure you plug in the fan for the processor. This one plugs into the CPU fan 1. Next, let's install the graphics card. This one goes into one of the PCI slots at the back of the case. Simply remove one of the covers, gently press it into the receptacle, and tighten it down. Consult your motherboard manual if you're in doubt. Next up is the power supply. Again, this is another component which can be selected based on your demands. This just mounts up to the back of the case. Simply slide it in and insert the included screws. We'll untie the cables and move them out to the side a bit because, as you see, it's about to get a little bit more crowded inside the case. Next, we're going to plug in the wires coming from the peripherals on the front of the case into the indicated receptacles on the motherboard. Again, your wiring will depend on what your case has and what your motherboard supports. In our case, we'll be wiring in the following plugs. The reset switch, the hard drive LED, the power LED, the front USB connector, the power switch, and the included motherboard speaker. After we get those cables landed, we'll just do a little bit of cable management to keep things somewhat organized. We'll clean this up completely once we put the rest of the components in. Next is the hard drive bay. Make sure that the connectors face inwards towards the motherboard so that you can attach the SATA and power plugs. This bay should just drop right in. Put the optical drive bay in next. Now that we've got all the components in, it's time to supply them with power. First up is the main power plug for the motherboard. This is keyed and goes in one way, as you can see here. It may take a little bit of force. Be careful and press down until it clicks in. Next is the CPU connector. It goes into its labeled connector on the motherboard as well. This is also keyed and should click in as well. You will no doubt have a couple of leads that you will have no use for. In our case, we have no use for those red connectors. We'll dress those back to keep them out of the way. This next power lead has two different connectors. One will power our case fans. The other will power an I/O board which we will install later in one of the PCI slots. We'll plug the fan ins from the front and the rear and make sure that that other power connector will reach to the lower right corner of our case. The other two leads from our power supply have connectors to power optical drive and the hard drives. They're keyed L shape as shown here. We'll plug these in and dress them so that they stay neatly out of the way. Next up are the SATA cables for the optical drive and the hard drives. These are keyed and click into place on each of these components. Once all of those plugs are in, it's time to dress the wiring. This is more of a matter of preference, but the most important thing to bear in mind is to keep all the wires out of any rotating components in your case. Any drooping wires could inhibit fan motion and ultimately cause your PC to overheat or worse, damage the components. And with that, the physical build is completed. Next, fire up the PC. Since there's nothing really on this computer yet, it should boot up to the motherboard management screen, where you can customize the settings. For our application needs, the only things that we need to modify are the date and the time and the SATA mode configuration, found under the Advanced and Integrated Peripherals. Change it to RAID mode. I also removed the MSI splash screen on startup. Once that's completed, we'll save changes and reboot. Since we're using the hard drives as RAID, let's set that up next. On startup, hit Control and I to set that up. Select Create RAID Volume. Give it a name, OS_RAID in our case. RAID Level 1 or Mirror, and select the disks. We want the OS on the two 500 gig drives, so select those, then select Create Volume and hit Y. This will take you back to the disk screen, where we can do the RAID setup on the other two drives. We'll name them images_vol. It knows that there are only two other drives available, so you don't have to select them. Once you've created the RAID volumes, you'll see they're listed as members of the various RAID volumes. Now we can exit the RAID setup. Next up, we need to install an operating system. We chose Windows 7 for this build. Boot from the disk. Windows will load up the files. Select what applies to you. We'll do a custom install so that we can install the OS to the drive that we want. That is the 500 gig drive. Then it'll extract everything to the drive for you. This will take some time. Once it's done, it will restart. There will be a fair amount of restarting during this process. Once it's restarted a couple times, you'll be asked to enter a username and computer name for the PC. These two names cannot be the same as each other. Don't worry if you don't know what to call it, you can always change it later. After that, enter your Windows product key. You don't need to see mine since you'll have your own, so we'll cut past this. The other few settings it'll ask you for is if you want to install updates and the time zone you're in. For this application, we don't want it updating. Congratulations, you've now got Windows 7 installed on a PC you just built. However, we're not quite done yet. Next, we need drivers. Currently, the motherboard is running, but it doesn't know how to properly utilize the ports that are plugged into it. So we'll insert the disks and install the drivers that we want. In this case, we want the drivers for the Intel chipset, the LAN network drivers, and the RAID drivers. This will require a restart. Once those have installed and the computer is restarted, we'll also install the audio driver, Google Chrome, Intel ME drivers, and the Intel USB 3.0 drivers. A little more waiting, some more restarts, and that should be good to go. We have one more set of drivers which we need to install, and those are the drivers for the graphics card. We'll drop that disk in and select to install the drivers for the VGA port. Once that's done, we still need to set up the second RAID volume from Windows. We're currently just looking at the 500 gig RAID, and we'll need to tell Windows that there's another RAID volume that we'd like to use. Open the Start menu and type Disk Management. This will go out and search for additional volumes which you might want to add to your computer, which it did. Right-click on the volume and select Create Simple Volume. The wizard will walk you through the setup for this, and then we'll format the volume how you designated it. Once it's done, we'll give it a name, images_vol in our application. That's it. You'll notice that the message box has popped up saying we have a new volume, as expected. With that, this build is officially finished. Since we build this PC for a customer, we just need to drop in some programs which they require and install them in the proper locations, that is, on the 500 gig hard drives. We installed Teledyne Dulcis Supera LT Cam Expert for the frame grabber, since this is a Vision PC. We also install x64 CamLink Express, Sherlock, IPPRT, IFC drivers, WinRAR, and Adobe Reader. All of these programs, again, are installed as per the application requirements. I hope you found this video to be helpful and informative. Have a great day.